In the 1990s, game shows were a dominant force in British television, offering a blend of entertainment, competition, and suspense that captivated millions. Following the immense success of Gladiators, which became a cultural phenomenon, ITV was eager to expand its lineup of game shows and develop a new action-adventure series. They turned to Carlton and 20th Century Fox and asked them to come up with a brand new, exciting, action-packed adventure game show. What did they come up with? Well, if you combine action, adventure, science fiction, hammy acting, a ridiculously expensive set, and John Leslie wearing a makeshift spacesuit, you get Scavengers. In each episode, two teams of scavengers travel by spaceship to the stricken cargo ship Cyclops, where they must battle it out in a series of challenges as they attempt to scavenge as much salvageable material as possible before making it back on board Vulture before the time runs out. Imagine the Crystal Maze, but on a spaceship. The show debuted in the summer of 1994, occupying the coveted 6 p.m. Saturday evening slot that Gladiators filled when it was on the air, but was eventually relegated to the graveyard Monday morning slot. Needless to say, this show didn't do very well, and only aired for 13 episodes. But there's something about it that I quite like, that I just can't put my finger on. Maybe it's the over-the-top special effects, the sheer earnestness of its intergalactic drama, its vague resemblance to the Crystal Maze, the show I regard as the greatest game show of all time, or perhaps it's just good old nostalgia, taking me back to a time when TV was unapologetically fun and a little bit wacky. Whatever it is, while Scavengers may not have been a hit, it remains an intriguing, quirky, nostalgic gem from the 90s. And in this video, we're going to take a look back at this unique slice of television history and relive a time when television was willing to boldly go where no game show had gone before. Buckle up as we embark on a journey through the cosmos and the curious world of Scavengers. Before we dive in, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and please give this video a thumbs up. Your support is greatly appreciated. Scavengers originally began life as a concept called Aliens the Game Show. The hugely successful film franchise began in 1979 with the original film Alien, starring Sigourney Weaver. And ITV, Carlton, and 20th Century Fox attempted to capitalize on the franchise's success by developing a game show with the same name. It is said that after learning of this, Ridley Scott refused to allow a game show to have the same name as one of his most successful films, and so the title was eventually changed to Scavengers. The overall format of the show is relatively simple. Two teams of two scavengers, each consisting of one man and one woman, would be taken to the stricken cargo ship Cyclops on board the salvage ship Vulture. They would then have 51 minutes to complete a series of challenges with the goal of retrieving as much salvageable material as possible. Why the time limit was exactly 51 minutes, I'll never know. In each challenge, items of salvage would have a corresponding amount of salvage points, usually referred to as SPs. SPs for items of salvage ranged from 1 to 50, with some challenges having a special item worth 100 SP available between the two teams for an individual challenge. At the end of the episode, if they made it back on board Vulture in time with their salvage, they would win the game and would be entered onto the Scavengers League table alongside scavengers from other episodes. Teams were guided around the maze-like corridors and levels of Cyclops by John Leslie, who at the time was most famous for presenting Blue Peter. He was certainly an odd choice for Maze Master, as he didn't quite fit the character that the role demanded, unlike some of the great game show Maze Masters such as Richard O'Brien on The Crystal Maze or Treguard in Nightmare, both of whom were perfect fits for their roles. Nevertheless, it's Commander John Leslie we've got for this one. His job was essentially to guide the team around Cyclops and give some advice before each challenge commenced. Alongside John was a robot, imaginatively named Android, played by actress Anna Galvin. She stayed on board Vulture throughout each episode, and her job was to provide directions and tactical information to the team once the salvage operation had begun. She also kept track of the scores, providing status updates at the request of John Leslie. The show was originally conceived as a team versus the house game, in which scavengers would be playing against the show, similar to the Crystal Maze, attempting to retrieve as much salvage as possible. However, shortly before filming started, ITV changed this and insisted on there being a winner on each episode. To that end, it was decided that there would be 2 teams of scavengers competing against each other. I don't think this change was particularly necessary, as the rules of the show stated that if scavengers didn't make it back on board Vulture at the end, they would be abandoned on Cyclops and would score 0 salvage points. And there were episodes when both teams were unable to make it back on time, meaning there was no winner. But anyway, I digress. The special effects on the show were quite impressive, and the designers on the show included Jim Francis, who had previously worked on British science fiction shows Blake's 7 and Doctor Who, and Bob Keane, who was one of the team that brought Jabba the Hutt to life in Return of the Jedi. One of the things that was particularly impressive about Scavengers was the set. The show was filmed at Pinewood Studios just outside London, and at a cost of around £2.5 million, the set was an absolute beast. For its time and even by today's standards, it is one of the biggest and most ambitious sets ever built for a game show. Designed by Quentin Chases, who had previously designed the arena games for Gladiators, the main set on board the abandoned cargo ship Cyclops was enormous, and the panning shots of the ship from the outside kind of remind me of Red Dwarf. The set really draws you into the sci-fi universe the show was attempting to create, and was certainly one of the more impressive things about the show. This set was also used for a number of international versions of Scavengers in Italy, Spain, Japan, and Scandinavia. Such a large set enabled the show to showcase a wide variety of games for teams to compete in. In fact, most episodes featured completely different games, which helped to keep the show fresh. Let's take a look through a few of the games that featured in the show. The Crusher was played quite often at the start of episodes, and involved both teams rummaging around in a trash compactor for salvageable fuel rods. Each rod the team collected would be worth 10 salvage points. In Torpedo Chamber, teams had to work together to retrieve detonators by hoisting torpedoes up onto the rack and then removing the detonators. There were quite a few games like this that required teamwork, with teams both scoring the same number of salvage points if successful. Cage Run requires teams to retrieve isotopes from damaged crystal flasks. They say crystal flasks, but they were really just plastic water bottle coolers with holes cut in the bottom. Essentially, one team member had to go across to the other side and send the crystal flasks back, but the flasks were leaking from the bottom, meaning teams had to be quick or the salvageable isotopes would fall through and be lost forever. This game also had a special flask in the middle that contained 5 isotopes, if anyone had the time to retrieve it. Some of the games on the show were quite physically demanding. In Webs, players had to climb down a large spider's nest made of ropes to retrieve arachnoid pods from the bottom and return them to the top. Looks simple enough, but this looked like it must have been quite physically draining. Acid House was quite reminiscent of Air Supply from the Crystal Maze, one of my favourite games from that show. In fact, I remember getting quite scared of this game as a kid, thinking that contestants would literally be lost in space forever if they fell. In the Scavengers version of this game, teams had to traverse across a pool of acid and retrieve metal canisters from the central spray head. Again, this is a game that could be quite physically demanding. In one episode, one player just decided not to even try, despite John Leslie trying to convince her to just go for it. There were so many different games that appeared on the show that I won't go through all of them here. But this was definitely one of the show's strengths, in that every episode featured mostly different games, keeping things fresh, rather than just recycling the same games over and over. Now, one of the more peculiar aspects of the show was the ongoing action movie subplot to the show's events. In the first episode, we are introduced to the villain of the show, Lord Tanarg, and he isn't best pleased about John Leslie trespassing on his ship and sends Predator-esque aliens to kill him. Every episode sees Leslie get into some kind of trouble as Tanarg tries everything he can to get his revenge. But by far the best of these was probably in episode 2, when Tanarg sends a mercenary to kill the commander. A mercenary who is able to shapeshift into an evil version of John Leslie. We then get this truly memorable piece of acting.
What the hell are you? Your worst nightmare.
The real John Leslie notices that the imposter is almost a perfect copy, except that he has a scar on the wrong side of his face. The two square off in a duel, with one of them being killed, and it isn't clear which of the two have survived. Then we see the victor touching the scar, and it's still on the wrong side. But when the camera pulls back, we realize Leslie was looking in a mirror the whole time. He hadn't been killed after all. I can see what they were going for here with these B-plot vignettes, but they end up coming across as a little bit ridiculous, not least due to the fact that John Leslie is by no means a trained actor. Also, this subplot is never brought up when Leslie is with the Scavengers. He just continues guiding them through the ship as if nothing has happened, which makes it all the more surreal. In the lead up to the first episode of Scavengers, Carlton's press office promoted it as the first virtual fantasy show, and the Times described it as Mad Max meets Star Trek on It's a Knockout. The show's creator and producer Julian Grant said before the first broadcast, "If people like it, it could go for years and years. If not, it's a lost cause. Lots of television ideas are." Unfortunately, it would be the latter of Julian's remarks that would come to pass. The show ran for a total of 13 episodes and was initially broadcast in one of TV's most prized time slots, 6 p.m. on Saturday evenings. But due to incredibly poor ratings, the show was dropped after just a few episodes, and it wouldn't be until about a year later that the second half of the show would be broadcast on Monday mornings at 9:25 a.m. This time slot was a death sentence for Scavengers, and the show was never renewed. Now that we've taken a look at the origins and development of the show, let's now take a look back at one episode of the show in full and follow Commander John Leslie and our Scavengers as they attempt to salvage as much as they can from Cyclops. Each episode starts with these panning shots in space of the mothership Scavenger before we zoom into the shuttlecraft Vulture, the craft that Commander John Leslie will take our 4 Scavengers to Cyclops in. Inside Vulture, John recaps the rules of the show and then introduces us to our 2 teams. On the red team we have Dawn and Peter, and on the yellow team we have Victoria and Scott. John briefly interviews both teams to learn a little more about them, and then introduces us to Android, and she tells us more about Cyclops, the stricken cargo ship we are en route to. Apparently, Cyclops is 16 kilometers in length with 156 levels. John then tells the teams to put their helmets on as they come in to land. The visuals here are quite impressive, almost something you'd see in a Hollywood film rather than a game show. On Cyclops, the team start the first of many runs through the weaving corridors of the ship towards the first game, Crusher. As mentioned earlier, this game requires teams to rummage around in the trash compactor for salvageable fuel rods, each worth 10 SP. Both teams get stuck in, flinging around these seemingly paper-light sheets of metal in search of the fuel rods. The Crusher then starts closing in on the teams as they scramble to escape on time. Some good camera work here, making this game look a lot more dangerous than it actually is. Both teams successfully escape, and we learn that the red team found 5 fuel rods and the yellow team found 4, putting the red team in the lead 50-40. The next game is Steelworks, in which teams must retrieve titanium ore nuggets from boxes located high on the chamber walls, each worth 5 salvage points. Android says that the steel structures in the room are very unstable, and that teams should work together on this one and share the salvage. On their journey to the game, Android tells John that there are other intelligences on the ship monitoring their progress. We'll come back to this a little later. At Steelworks, everyone drops down onto this very rickety bridge which promptly collapses behind them. John then proceeds on to the other side as the teams prepare for the challenge. But then an alien-like creature shoots the bridge, causing it to collapse with our dear commander on it. John climbs back up and the teams get started with the challenge, electing to use the rails from the fallen bridge to create a makeshift ladder to get high enough to retrieve the titanium ore nuggets. That definitely looks safe, doesn't it? One of the 4 climb up this ladder and pass down the steel boxes that contain the titanium, whilst the others rummage through them for the salvage. After retrieving as much as they can, they attempt to raise the bridge that was destroyed earlier, but quickly realize that this probably isn't the safest option and instead decide to climb down. They hilariously leave Dawn from Team Red to climb down on her own, and she ends up in the drink. The team were able to retrieve all 10 titanium ore nuggets, scoring the maximum of 50 points each. We learn that the next game is the bomb disposal chamber, but before that we get our first glimpse of Lord Tanarg, who warns John Leslie that he and the scavengers are trespassing on his ship. Back to the challenges, John explains the rules of the game in the bomb disposal chamber. Teams have to remove detonators from the bombs in front of them by removing the lids without letting the metal rings touch the 3 prongs sticking out of the top. They can let 1 or 2 metal rings touch, but not 3. John, holding what he believes is a dud detonator, then frightens the life out of Peter.
Alright, simple as that, it's quite easy. Oh! Maybe it wasn't a dead one after all.
Both teams get 2 shots at this. Don and Peter go first, but are unfortunately unsuccessful on their first attempt. Then Victoria and Scott, having seen the strategy Don and Peter were using, decide to try something different, but set off 2 of the metal prongs almost immediately. They focus all of their attention on the middle, longer prong, and are able to successfully lift the lid off and retrieve the detonator. On their second attempts, both teams were successful, and we get a score update from Android. Don and Peter have 125 salvage points, and Victoria and Scott have 140. The next game is Solar Tower, and the aim is to retrieve solar cells from the bottom of the chamber. The first team to retrieve the solar cells and make it back to the top earns the SPs for those cells collected, whilst the other team earns nothing. Both female scavengers go down and start retrieving the solar cells, whilst the male scavengers have the task of winching them all the way back up before the time runs out. In a physically demanding race, in the end, both teams make it back to the top at the exact same time, and Android announces that it was a dead heat, meaning both teams score SPs for the solar cells they collected. Before the next game, we go back to Lord Tanarg and his mission to destroy Commander John Leslie. Tanarg sends 2 aliens to kill John, who is for some reason now on his own in Cyclops. John finds himself surrounded, but is able to shoot one of the aliens with his laser gun, which I didn't even know he had. But instead of just shooting the other one, who is standing right there, John decides to run away like an action hero. Tanarg is frustrated and teleports the alien to where John has run to, and this is probably the most awkward chase scene I've ever seen. Just when John thinks he's safe, the alien reappears. But again, rather than just shooting the alien, John uses his superhuman strength to rip a pipe off the wall and launch it at the alien's chest, causing it to evaporate. And Tanarg vows to get his revenge. John then magically appears back with the scavengers as they proceed on to the next game, Airlock. In this game, teams must retrieve large batteries from the airlock. However, when these batteries are removed from their terminals, the door to the airlock closes, and teams have to communicate codes that are on top of the door on the inside of the airlock to the scavenger standing on the outside, who can then key these in on the other side to figure out the correct order of the symbols for the scavenger on the inside to key in to open the door. My explanation is probably a bit convoluted, but it's a relatively simple game. The majority of this game is just listening to the teams describe the symbols they see in front of them, so I won't bore you with that. The yellow team were able to complete the challenge, but were literally milliseconds too late and scored no points, and the red team completely messed up some of the symbols and were unsuccessful in completing the challenge. Both teams scored no salvage points for this game. The penultimate game is Rupture Chamber, in which teams must retrieve water filtration flasks from water pipes, worth 25 SPs each. In this game, teams first have to work together to replace a large lid on the bottom of the water pipe in order to redirect the flow of water up through the tubes on the side. But after this, the teams are competing against each other and must plug the holes in the side of the tubes, allowing the water filtration flasks to float up to the top to be retrieved. The first team to get both of their flasks out wins. This game doesn't really look that difficult, as after the lid is back on, all they have to do is put corks into the holes in the pipes and retrieve the flasks. In the end, the yellow team are the first to get their 2 flasks out, winning 50 salvage points. And the points going into the final game are 230 for Team Yellow and 280 for Team Red. And then we come to the last game, the Final Abyss. The aim of this game is to construct a swing to carry salvage and themselves across the water pool in front of them in order to escape Cyclops on Vulture. There is also additional salvage available if teams have enough time to get it across before the time runs out. The barrels are worth 20 SP, the fuel rods are worth 15, and the ammunition boxes are worth 10. Teams have to construct the swing, get themselves and their salvage across the void, and board Vulture before the time runs out. If they don't make it on time, they will be abandoned on Cyclops. After arriving at the final abyss, John Leslie zip lines across to board Vulture, tells the teams they have 6 minutes left, and the teams get started on building their swings. In order to construct the swings, teams must first climb up a large girder and attach a rope to the end, then winch up the end of the girder to the correct position for the swing to function and secure an A-frame to support the swing. Once the swing is constructed, one scavenger swings across, allowing them to work together to pull salvage across to the other side. Both teams get off to a good start, getting their swings constructed in good time. Peter from the red team is the first to swing across to the other side, followed shortly thereafter by Scott. The girls on the other side then have to attach salvage to the rope for the boys to winch over. While all this is going on, the aliens on Cyclops are shooting laser guns at the scavengers, causing explosions to go off all around them. The teams frantically try to get all of their salvage across, and with less than a minute to spare, Victoria from Team Yellow makes her way across the void with the last of the salvage and makes it on board Vulture with Scott. It looks like the red team are right behind them as Dawn makes her way across, and as the seconds count down, Peter makes a run for it, but Dawn gets tangled up in the netting and is trapped. Unfortunately, as Peter goes back to rescue Dawn, the time runs out, Android closes the door to Vulture, and Peter and Dawn are abandoned on Cyclops. The yellow team, Victoria and Scott, are declared winners, and their score is entered onto the Scavengers League table. John Leslie and the yellow team don't seem too bothered about the fact that they've just left the red team behind, and they celebrate making it off Cyclops in time with their salvage. John then sets course for home, Vulture blasts off, and with that, this episode of Scavengers is over. Scavengers was an incredibly ambitious game show. The extremely expensive and realistic set, as well as the special effects employed, gave the show a unique feel that producers felt could potentially be a huge success, similar to that of other adventure game shows like The Crystal Maze. But unfortunately, Scavengers didn't quite reach those heights. Perhaps the show was pushing the realism a little too much, or maybe its blend of action, sci-fi drama, and game show elements proved to be too niche for mainstream audiences. Despite its high production value and ambitious scope, Scavengers struggled to find its footing and connect with viewers in the same way as its contemporaries. But credit should be given to the creators of this show for attempting something so bold. In its brief run, Scavengers managed to carve out a unique niche. And while it will never be considered one of the all-time great game shows, it's a fascinating and nostalgic piece of television history for those who remember its brief but memorable moment in the spotlight. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the cosmos and the curious world of Scavengers, and if you enjoyed this video and want to revisit more hidden gems from television's past, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks everyone, and see you in the next one.